So welcome back to the next panel. So technology has really eliminated the middleman in many industries. And it's taken a long time, I think, for it to truly penetrate healthcare. And one of the main reasons, I think, is it hasn't really been feasible to have patient-centered technology until now. One of the most amazing things, I think, about what we've heard in the last 2 days is the fact that everybody really in the industry is beginning to reorient around patient-specific, patient-centered data. And in order to do that, the current vogue for personal technology is going to have to move from a consumer to a medical space. And to lead a discussion around this on personal monitoring for disease management, we're very fortunate to have Joe Kvedar, who is the Vice President of Connected Health at Partners Healthcare, and who has really been a pioneer in this field for over 20 years. Joe, welcome to you and to the panel for this next session.
Here's a scenario for you. You get a message on your phone, and it's from your doctor. And it says, our computer algorithm has been going over all of your recent stats, your labs, all of your monitoring. Things look pretty good, but there's one outlier. Your voice analytics, our voice analytics software is telling us that you're in danger of an acute cardiac event in the next few weeks. Don't worry, we're on top of it. Again, our computer algorithm is going to be monitoring your med adherence, your activity level, your blood pressure, your heart rate, and continuing to analyze that voice pattern. But I would suggest you curtail travel and, of course, alert us if you have any symptoms. Does that sound completely futuristic? After all, these guys invited a dermatologist to chair a panel at a cardiac meeting. But everything I mentioned is now available, including the voice analytics. There was a paper presented at last year's American Heart last fall that showed that there's a unique voice signature for people with an impending cardiac event. This is the world we're going to talk about for the next 50 minutes or so, and I have to say this is a unique panel, and we really thank Callum and Tony and Chris for giving us the opportunity to take you a little bit out of the zone of traditional healthcare delivery and talk about this rapidly growing area of personal monitoring. I have 4 very talented, unique perspectives, and I'll introduce my fellow panelists in a moment. I say a little bit about the ground rules. We decided we would limit ourselves to clinical scenarios and applications for the most part. The world of personal fitness monitoring is exploding around us, and someday these 2 areas, of course, will collide. But for now, because we're in the World Innovation Forum for Partners Healthcare, we're going to focus on more clinical applications. This is also going to be a mix of future and present, and it has to be. There is much going on in the present. I don't want anyone to leave a room thinking this is just about the future. But of course, like my scenario, we will venture into the future. That's part of what you want to get out of the talent that's next to me on stage. So let me introduce my fellow panelists. To my direct left is Adam Landman. He's the Chief Information Officer at Brigham and Women's Hospital, also a longtime innovator in the space. To his left is Michael Reitermann, Chief Operating Officer for Siemens Healthineers. Next to him, Jonathan Rennert, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Zoll Medical, a local device company. And then finally, Stan Shaw. Stan has been involved in this area of data and patient-generated data for many, many years. He just took a role at the Brigham as the Chief Scientific Officer for the new One Brave Idea project. So he'll have a lot of interesting perspectives. I've got 2 academic-oriented docs and then 2 folks from industry. So we're going to try to make it a little bit provocative. We won't always agree on everything. That's part of the point, and we should have fun with it. So what I want to start out with, because it's probably on some people's minds, maybe more than just a few, is to really take a look at the evidence for a moment. There have been plenty of clinical trials that might have suggested that perhaps this idea of monitoring patients in their home won't really lead to better outcomes. Maybe this is all just a fad. Maybe the future of healthcare delivery is right in your doctor's office, and that's as far as it goes. I certainly don't believe that to be the case. I think there's plenty of opportunity for us to move care as a direct and continuous function in your life. I have a group of people that work with me at Partners that are making that vision possible. But again, there's some people who would disagree. So I want to tackle how much evidence is enough. I want to get from our industry colleagues their view of whether they feel like to move a product into this space, they need solid clinical trial evidence, and have my academic colleagues comment on it as well. I'll start out by saying that in, I think it was 2016, just about a year ago, the AHRQ came out with a brief on evidence for telehealth. They do these briefs from time to time. And of all the things they reviewed in telehealth, one that came to the top was indeed that they felt that of reviewing the evidence, there was sufficient evidence to recommend the use of home monitoring devices in the care of cardiac, particularly congestive heart failure, but other cardiac conditions. So with that, I'm going to start with Adam to my left and just say, Adam, is that enough evidence or do we need more?
So maybe can I start with a little bit of just background and just, we'll take the example of heart failure, and it applies to all chronic diseases. One of the challenges is the multifactorial causes. So what leads to readmissions? And there may be patient factors, so the patient may not be compliant with their medications or their diet. There may be disease-specific factors that their heart disease may just be getting worse. There may be provider factors. The provider doesn't prescribe the right medications or make the appropriate referral at the right time. And then there may be resource challenges as well, like the patient may not have home care or may have other challenges. And so I think first just recognizing that this is a very interdisciplinary and complex issue to solve, and that a technology solution alone is not the solution. And I think as we start looking at the interventions and looking at some of the evidence, there have certainly been successes, but there have been some important, particularly in the CHF space, there have been some important large randomized controlled trials that have not been positive. And so I think we probably have to look really carefully at what are the interventions, both technology, people interventions, and really figure out which of those components are successful and what's needed for the successful ones to disseminate and have the same impact everywhere else. So to come back to your question, I would say we still need to do some additional work to identify what is the right intervention, what's the right group that these interventions should be applied to.
Stan, I'm going to move to you. I know you had some thoughts on this, and then we'll get the industry perspective. How do we, so I can't disagree with you, Adam. Every academic will always tell you more research is needed, right? That's how we make a living. But seriously, I agree that the evidence is solid, but there's nuances. And I think for every study that I've read that's negative, I could probably posit a reason why I believe it turned out to be negative. And it does have to do with how the intervention is designed. It's not the technology. So Stan, what's your thought about this? And is there a way that we can do evidence differently? One of the challenges is if I do a clinical trial on a device today, by the time I get it published, it looks like something from the Jetsons. Tell us your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so I certainly am a strong believer that evidence and publication of the results of trials, even if they're negative, will be very important to get buy-in from all the stakeholders and to move the field forward. As opposed to a traditional clinical or research study. I think the audiences are very broad for these kinds of studies. There's certainly the physician audience of what are the impacts on clinical outcomes, but we really have to also keep in mind what is what's the patient experience, what's the patient perspective on how these interventions are perceived, and are they felt to help the patients improve their experience, improve their autonomy. And then certainly on the stakeholder side, we have to consider the effect on costs and utilization. So, you know, there are parables of digital or home health monitoring tools that have been published. There was one, for instance, from Omada Health, and it was interesting that they actually, in the title of the article, it says, you know, about the study resulting from a partnership between a digital health company and an academic medical center. And we usually don't put that in a title, but I think it speaks to how unusual it is and maybe how important it will be going forward. Another parable might be a study of the Zio patch, right? So they compared for arrhythmia detection, they discovered essentially a wearable adhesive single lead patch for 2 weeks versus the tried and true Holter monitor 3-lead EKG for 24 hours. And in terms of reaching a definitive diagnosis, the 2-week wearable outperformed the Holter. I don't think this would be a surprise to the cardiologist. But what was interesting was that if you ask the patients which did they prefer, by about 80%, they preferred a wearable patch, right? And there's going to be many form factors, there's going to be many participants from industry, and about 70–80% of the patients felt that wearing the Holter interfered with their life, right? So this is very unusual to see these kind of top-line results, but I think it's critical. And then now you see that the general class, just taking a step back from the particular device, the general class of an external wearable is now percolating into consensus guidelines. So this is, what we're talking about is a very profound cultural change. And I think it's like the awkward teenage years, that there's a great future in the 20s and 30s and beyond. And you know, clinical evidence is going to make all the stakeholders more comfortable about dipping their toes in the next steps.
Jonathan, tell us about your company's strategy around gathering evidence. Does every product need a clinical trial? How do you sort that out?
So every product needs evidence to support its safety and efficacy, or we can't get it approved, which is very different, I think, from true outcome-based research. Zoll probably has one of the larger purely wearable medical technology businesses today with our LifeVest, which is a wearable cardio defibrillator that's prescribed for a few months generally for patients who are at high risk of sudden death. You know, that product has been on the market for more than a decade based on evidence that it was safe and effective. If someone goes into cardiac arrest, VF or VTAC, the device shocks them with the same efficacy of an ICD. We still, even though today there are in the US probably over 25,000 patients wearing a LifeVest, being protected from arrhythmic death, that's probably only 30% of the total that are you know, clinically at risk or would meet, you know, current CMS reimbursement guidelines. And a lot of the resistance that we see is this question of evidence, right? And so it hasn't been, you know, I would say a barrier to getting into the market, but it is certainly an obstacle in driving, you know, the majority of adoption for patients who could benefit from a given treatment. And in our space, you know, outcomes-based trials are difficult to run. You know, there are many underlying causes of cardiac arrest. And if a cardiac arrest occurs, there is the classic, chain of survival of many linked therapeutic steps that have to happen in a timely manner, one after the other, to give that patient a decent chance of survival. And most of the trials that we run, while you'd like to think you're really just testing the intervention from an efficacy standpoint, what you're really testing is the system of care from an effectiveness standpoint, right? And so you're only changing one thing along the path, but in the end, that outcome measurement is dictated by a lot of random events, before and after the thing you're studying. So, we understand it as clinicians, certainly, in this audience in particular, I think are very, very much interested in evidence-based, high-quality evidence, blinded, randomized trials. They end up being very difficult to do, and if we were to not change practice until we had, the definitive trial work completed, I think we'd be more than a decade behind where we are, and we would have put a lot of patients at risk.
Michael, what's your perspective on this question?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for inviting me here to the World Medical Innovation Forum. Great event. And I think probably next year's event has also an impact on what we discuss in this session.
Yes, indeed.
Clearly, probably many of you know that our products you cannot wear usually at your wrist. They are a little bit larger. I think the smallest device that we actually provide is a handheld coagulation device, which has the size of maybe 2 cell phones put together. But coming to your question regarding outcome-based evidence, this is, and I go back maybe 15 years. 15 years ago, when we brought a product to market, and it was cool from an innovation perspective, people jumped at it. That has completely changed. Mm-hmm. Now, you basically have to demonstrate that you have a clinical impact, that you basically make a difference, whether it's clinically, operationally, financially, to the healthcare system and the patient. And we don't go now through extended clinical trials, but we work with a lot of academic medical centers in the United States. I think we have about 200 sites that we work together with a lot of resources from our perspective. And what we do is, of course, test new products, what they can do, and then get the outcome. And because I'm a firm believer that if you improve patient care or the financial side of patient care, then you will actually climb the adoption curve much faster. And to not pick an example in the US, for example, in cardiovascular, the placement of pacemakers. We're working with King's College in the UK, basically taking an MRI, 3D, overlaying to the fluoroscopy when you place the pacemaker in order to see whether we can do actually a better job in placing that. We have done, I think, now about 15 patients. And in the past, that would probably have been good enough to get the adoption. Everybody would be excited. But now you basically have to say, what did I change in patient care? And I think this is for all of us, I think whether it's now personal home health devices or large MRIs or interventional cath labs or analyzers, I think it's the same for all of us. And we got to pass that test.
So maybe I can summarize this little bit and say evidence gathering is alive and well. It's a foundation, especially for something like we're talking about today, which is a new model of care delivery. That said, technology is not like a drug. In other words, we don't do a monitor versus a placebo kind of trial. It's an intervention. And the intervention has to be thoughtfully designed, and you test the intervention versus the lack of intervention or usual care. So when you see papers that seem to conflict, I would say look carefully at how the intervention was designed, and you'll usually find the secret to why it may have failed. I'm going to tackle now something else that I think is a sort of elephant in the room with this vision of delivering care outside of traditional care settings using monitoring tools. Once again, as my original scenario predicts, we anticipate a future, and it's not that distant a future, where you really will get most of your care in a continuous fashion, that this idea of an episode in the office is going to become a bit of an afterthought. It's not that you won't need to visit your doctor, communicate with your doctor, quite the contrary, but that you'll have this continuous care as a function in your life due to the ability for us to continuously collect data and to interact with you in a in-the-moment fashion using your mobile device. What that does, though, is it sets us up for a quandary because it takes away care from traditional settings. Those of us in the care delivery business have all invested in brick and mortar of one form or another, whether it be hospitals, clinics, surgery centers, what have you. And we're talking about a future where those brick and mortar assets may need to shrink. So I want to ask particularly, I'm going to start with Adam, but then I'm going to open it up to get views on how we can overcome that barrier if we're going to move this vision forward. And can we provide a path to hospital administrators that makes it less scary for them to adopt these technologies, knowing that if they do so, less people will come into the hospital?
So, and I may have a somewhat different perspective in the sense that in our hospitals, particularly in our tertiary academic medical centers, we are very much looking for opportunities to shift care to other settings so we can make room for other patients that need those tertiary and quaternary services. And so I think certainly for the academic medical centers, if we can deliver care in other settings that's appropriate, that has good outcome, that is very, very attractive. I also think with accountable care organizations, there is also incentive to deliver the right care to the patient at the right time, and to do that in a very cost-effective fashion. And so I think health policy will be an important tool to help with this shift. And as we're potentially continuing to shift towards accountable care, towards capitation, then those incentives really align, and I think that the hospitals will be on board with this.
I'd be interested if either of the gentlemen in the middle have a different view as you make sales into traditional healthcare settings. Is that the kind of thing you're hearing from us, or?
Okay. I mean, first a statement. I think if you look at population health, there's the triple aim. We want to improve the health of the population. We basically want to do it at lower cost per capita. And the third thing, we want to have a better patient experience. I think everything that supports that, and I think actually tele-home health could be, or will be, in my opinion, a big contributor to that. So I think it's probably a win-win, hopefully all around, and hopefully everybody perceives it as a win-win. I mean, Adam already said, in let's say at least in the academic centers, there is actually today the pressure. We don't have enough capacity in many cases. We actually, and I just quote a survey, I think it was Medscape, where 14,000 physicians were polled, and I think more than 50% actually showed sign of burnout. So I think there is something with the capacity in the health system where people feel they don't spend enough time on the appropriate care for patients anymore. And so I think if there is an opportunity to actually free up some capacity, then I'm all for it. And then now, of course, the question is for us as a company, how do I see it? I mean, if I look at the global demographics, still growing population, aging population, I think there's a statistic, 10,000 people sign up every day for Medicare in the United States now with the baby boomers, and that will continue for quite a few years. And I think we heard in earlier panels how much that means for the demand on the healthcare system. So I'm not worried. I think there might be a question of over and underutilization, is usually when you talk about imaging or when you talk about lab testing. I think there will be probably a lot more appropriate usage of those devices. So, Joe, not too worried about
Jonathan
that.
or Stan, care to comment on this one?
So
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to, so I think getting back to Alan's point on the policy front, my perception is that the talk around a different model of reimbursement is far ahead of the reality. I would go back, probably 3 years or 4 years ago, sort of all the rage in the pre-hospital environment in EMS, the concept of what they were calling community paramedicine, where someone was going to pay for EMS to make essentially house calls to heart failure patients, make sure that they were taking their medications in a way to try to keep them out of the hospital, because that was either going to drive readmission penalties for the facilities, or it was going to be incentive to the insurance companies to lower the overall cost of care. And so there was a lot of discussion around that in my view really hasn't materialized to date. So I don't think that we have, for the talk of accountable care organizations and changing away from a fee-for-service reimbursement model, I don't think the reality is anywhere close to it, and I don't think the incentives for either the insurance companies or hospitals are strong enough to get them to fund, whether it's a community paramedicine visit or a wearable technology that might allow that patient to do that same work on their own. So I do think this is a largely policy-driven problem that we are not anywhere near where I think the talk would suggest we are.
Stan?
I have to speak from a profound relative ignorance of the business aspects. I have confidence that our leadership will take care of that. I would assume, to echo what's been said, there is a real hunger on the part of patients and frontline physicians to get back to that patient-doctor interaction. And so I think the use of these monitoring technologies to make the broader care network operate more efficiently can be a differentiator, both for the companies that are bringing these innovations into the system and for the hospitals and the physicians who are using them. And as these become more data intensive, I think somewhere along the line, whether it's from a plug-and-play solution from the company or data scientists at the institution who are really integrated into both the clinical enterprise and the research enterprise, someone's going to have to process all these signals and all these data and present it in an efficient way so that patients can get some insights, so that physicians view this as something that saves them time and lets them get back to just the act of doctoring. So I'm optimistic that, again, at steady state, when we get there, it will be a differentiator and it will be a profound net plus.
I like that. I'm going to turn to some audience questions. We have a number of them streaming in. They're all actually very thoughtful. The first one is on privacy. So people got a little worked up over my scenario, rightfully perhaps so, thinking this particular individual wants to know, is encryption the solution? Is it simply a technical solution if we are able to ensure end-to-end encryption around patient-generated data? Or is it perhaps that there's a generational attitudinal component where no matter how carefully your technical solution is, you're always going to have people, particularly those of us who are older, perhaps fearing this idea of loss of privacy. Care to comment on that, anyone?
Sir.
Well, I mean, I've always been struck at how much data people unwittingly share in a non-medical setting, right? The difference between in the healthcare community, the HIPAA provisions are so onerous relative to, and it's not clear that in a lot of cases that data is all that sensitive, but people are freely allowing their internet browsing history, their Facebook, status. I mean, lots of things that people are willing to share. It's just in an area that hasn't been regulated. So I don't think as a general public, we've had a good conversation about which data we really care about and to what level it should be protected.
Other thoughts?
Just building on that, and I think we spend a lot of time on information security. There are certainly technical solutions like encryption, like two-factor authentication, but they will never be perfect. And I think we rely on individuals, and so we have to do a good amount of education. I think the other piece that plays in building off of your comments, I think patients need to understand better what's happening with their data, and as we give patients their data, particularly at the hospital level, we're excited that as part of stage 3 meaningful use, there's actually a requirement that hospitals have an API where patients can actually authorize that their clinical data be released to different apps or different devices. And so that's going to enable all of this. And so we're starting to think about how do we make sure that the patient understands when they release that information what's going to happen to it, and that they are in control of their data, but that they need to understand the downstream implications of that. So I think education is going to be very, very important as we go forward.
I mean, technically, I would say, as Adam said, that there are ways to guarantee that. I mean, we have a cloud-based platform where we can share images now around the globe between institutions. I think for me, the challenge is probably from a personal device until it gets somewhere where all those encryptions work. But then on the other hand, if I'm not mistaken, I think Fitbit, for example, is a HIPAA-compliant device, at least when I remember that correctly. So I think there are ways even to have those personal monitoring devices to actually be relatively safe, but I agree with you, Adam, there is always the risk, and I think with what Jonathan said, what we are sharing, I think a lot of people would probably be willing to share that information then in order to get a health benefit as well.
I certainly agree with the importance of education, but I would gather, based on published studies, that a significant fraction of the public is ahead of where our regulations and our medical enterprises are. Obviously, we need to be very, very vigilant and very, very responsible. But when it's been looked at and people have been asked, are you willing to share your health information, including genetic information that predicts, in one study, your risk of developing cancer? What people are sensitive to are who is getting the information and what is the use intended for the information, right? And this is self-serving from my perch at an academic institution, but the top, most trusted recipient of medical data is an academic medical center. And the top, most trusted use case for medical data is medical research. And so you're seeing examples of public-private partnerships. I mean, One Brave Idea, sponsored by a partnership between the American Heart Association and Verily, formerly Google Life Sciences. And AstraZeneca is a foundational supporter as well. Right? These are, no offense, but if you look at that histogram, pharmaceutical companies, Facebook, they do not rank highly as a trusted recipient. So I think there's an opportunity where partnerships can really help bring technologies into the clinic, study them, help the ecosystem learn, and improve, I think, help with the comfort level from the patient perspective.
Let's go. There's one, I think, really interesting one here, and I'm looking at the clock. I want to leave time for some future predictions, but this is a compelling question. Asked, again, motivated by the scenario that I threw out, which is, will a patient really want to know every moment what their risk of having a heart attack is? Might knowing your risk actually increase your risk? So really, I would reframe it as monitoring data tell you a lot. They give you a lot of feedback about your lifestyle, your behavior. Sometimes we prefer not to be aware of that. On the other hand, who wants to have a large negative health event? What do you guys think about that dilemma?
We had a not related but a similar situation when I was in the molecular imaging business and we were looking at Alzheimer's scanning. No cure, you want to know whether you will get Alzheimer's. And we did a survey, about 1,000 people out there, and about 70% said, yes, I want to know, even though there is no cure. So I think clearly it doesn't impact your life, for sure, but at least study that we conducted, 70% wanted to know, even though there is no cure. And I don't know how that translates now to the question, but I think there is a willingness to be aware of what risk I'm at.
Yeah. So I'm going to interrupt, and if you'd like to cover this in the remaining time, but each one of you gets 90 seconds to tell us about the future. What will it look like in 10 years? What's going to be the biggest innovations? Start with Stan.
So I'll do something that's kind of an old idea, so back to the future. So I think this idea of home or remote monitoring will come to pass, and I hope that it will invoke an old idea from the 90s that came out of Xerox PARC, which is calm technology, right? So that the information will be in the periphery and it'll be non-obtrusive, and it'll just move to the center of your attention when it's needed, but it'll be easily adapted and fit into people's daily life. So I guess I would say I'm bullish, and I think an ecosystem is going to have to grow up that incorporates, patient care and research and large-scale population health in a way that is not siloed, but a little more unified.
Jonathan.
So I'll go back to something you said at the outset, Joe. I think over the next 10 years, what's exciting to us is, our ability to go synthesize from the vast data sets that we've collected here. I mean, we've had computers in medical devices now for probably 10 or 15 years, and over that time frame, just our own company, we literally have petabytes worth of patient data that we've collected, and exactly what you described. We can look, we've got histories of just ECGs of patients who go on to have a cardiac arrest and not have a cardiac arrest, and we can see things in that, to exactly what you described, to be able to give patients some actionable things, right? I think this question of is there anything you can do with the information is really the critical one, right? In terms of any diagnostic, it really comes down to what are you going to do with that information. But if you can tell someone, look, don't be alone over the next 24 to 48 hours, or don't be alone, don't take your life vest off, while you're alone or while you're showering, make sure that you've got someone with you, or don't drive. I mean, there are certain things people can go do that will improve the outcomes. And we're just getting started, I think, with machine learning algorithms and things to go look at the vast data that we've collected and try to provide useful information to guide people's lives.
Michael, you're up.
I think there are a couple of things that will determine how the 10 years look. I think the first one is what can we actually measure at home, then how precisely, how close to clinical measurements can we do it. Then for me, a third driver is then automated analytics, because with the amount of data we get, we will probably create more burnout if we don't do it properly. And the last one is the opportunity for compliance. And compliance means ease of use. How can that fit in the life of a patient who is at home? And I think in those four, I believe there will be tremendous progress. And so I believe in 5 to 10 years, probably every cardiac patient that gets discharged from the hospital, I believe, will have some of those monitoring devices, probably earlier discharge, probably better outcomes to be proven in studies. So I think the next 10 years will be exciting in that space.
Last word.
I'm going to build a little bit on your initial scenario and actually also go back to the 90s when Zach Kahane from Boston Children's and Pete Solovitz from MIT started a project called the Guardian Angel. And their project was that there would be technology that was sort of on your shoulder at all times, looking out for your best interests. So very similar to what you were describing. And I would argue that this is happening now in our devices, right? So your phones may be telling you now that it's looking at your calendar and it's telling you you actually need to leave now to get to your next to get to your next appointment. And so similarly, could your guardian angel have all of your electronic health record data, your imaging data, have the knowledge base, and be making personalized, actionable recommendations to you? And then if you're not acknowledging them, reaching out to your family members or your clinical team. And so I think we're going to get closer and closer to that. And we're already seeing that with continuous glucose monitors that have alerting capabilities. And so we are starting to see that vision come true. I think you will need clinical validation. I think we'll need to pay attention to the workflow for the clinicians to avoid further burnout, as well as to the patient. And we'll need to think about how we pay for these. But I think we're in an exciting time and almost there.
It is an exciting time, and I appreciate very much the collective wisdom of my fellow panelists. I would emphasize just a few things in summary. This future is upon us, and you're starting to see it in very interesting ways. A new generation of wearables that tells us, it gives us insights as opposed to numbers, different products that are able to extend healthcare out of the office. E-visits with your physician now quite common. So the world is changing in this way, and we look forward to, as it continues to change, being thoughtful about how we implement these things so that we continue to have high quality care and eventually see it as a way for also controlling cost and access. Thanks very much.
Thank you.